The Apex of Training and Development Show is the region's newest talk show. We strive to redefine the true meaning of training in different work environments. Tune in every Thursday night at 8 p.m. on CTV Channel 2 and on our Facebook page at The Apex of Training and Development Show. On tonight's episode, we have Clement Samuel, Sales Director at Digicel.
The culture an organization fosters is one of the competitive advantages that lead to success. Therefore, identifying and understanding some of the key variables is imperative. Welcome to the Apex of Training and Development Show. I am your host, Charian Casimir. On today's episode, we'll be speaking with Mr. Clement Samuel, Director of Sales for Digicel Antigua, Barbuda, and Montserrat, and we'll be discussing creating and maintaining an organizational culture of excellence. Mr. Samuel, it's a pleasure to have you on the Apex of Training and Development Show. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
All right. I read through your bio and I noticed you would have studied engineering, law. You're the director of sales for Digicel. Tell me how all those experiences have molded you into the leader that you are today.
Well, I think, first of all, I must say that I have done telecommunications all my life.
Wow.
I joined Cable and Wireless as a young 18-year-old way back when, and got sent off to the UK to study for 2 years. And I probably thought it was something that I'd get into for a few years and then I'd be off to do my dream, which at the time was to be a veterinary surgeon. But the more I went on, the more I liked it, the more I got more training, and the more I got entrenched in doing this and doing telecommunications. And then somewhere in my mid-30s, I sort of felt that I needed a new challenge. I was getting up in the morning and I wasn't as motivated, and I wanted a new challenge. And I discussed it with my dad, and he said to me, why don't you try studying law? I think it'll challenge you. And so I thought about it for another couple of years, and then decided to, take the challenge on, encourage my sister to join me. And 3 years later, we, both graduated with LLB degrees. At that point, we was like, what are we going to do with this degree? And so I thought that I wanted to take it further and go to law school and become an attorney. And so I took some time off from work, went off to study law school, got called to the bar in the UK. And at that time, felt that I was going to come back and help my dad in his practice. What I found, however, was that once I was at law school, I found that my love for telecommunications was greater than I thought, and so I came back and took a job with the government doing as a telecommunications officer. Mm-hmm. Did that for some years, and then I got an opportunity to do Digicel, which was a bit different, and I've been here 7 years now. So
wow, that's an interesting journey.
It is.
Tell us, what are some of the ups and downs of leadership?
The ups and downs of leadership are recognizing when you're doing the right thing. Sometimes doing the right thing isn't always apparent. People are people, and as leaders, you have got to deal with persons' idiosyncrasies, their nuances, the very varying backgrounds. And I think that one of the greatest challenges as a leader is being able to recognize all these things and understand that you've got to use different approaches for different circumstances.
Interesting. How would you define an organizational culture of excellence?
I think I would define an organizational culture of excellence as something that every company would want to aspire to. However, I think an organizational culture of excellence is basically precipitated by trying to do as much for the customer, who is the center of most organizations, mm-hmm. and trying to exceed their expectations and to give them value for what they're paying you for.
In what ways can you motivate your staff to see the bigger picture as it relates to that culture that you would like to create?
That sometimes can be difficult,
Mm-hmm.
but I think what you have got to do is you've got to first of all get the employees, your staff,
Mm-hmm.
to understand that what we do here is that we deliver a service.
Mm-hmm.
And every customer expects or should expect
Mm-hmm.
a level of service that is inferior to none, and should be expecting things that should make them go home smiling, thinking, I had a great service. And I think many times there are lots of things sometimes which mitigate against you giving that ultimately,
Mm-hmm.
but you've always got to try and get your staff to keep striving. Sometimes customers can be difficult, but the customer is always right. So, the customer is the center of everything that we do.
Mm-hmm.
And so you've just got to continue, keep trying, get your staff to recognize that many times they will be the customer and they would expect a certain level of service, and that they've got to aspire to always deliver that sort of service.
I absolutely love the fact that you just kept reinforcing that employees should always remember that they may be the customer and should always aspire to deliver that service. How do you go about selecting the requisite skill sets needed in order to create that culture of excellence? Because I know sometimes when you conduct an interview, a person may say, well, they may say all the things you would like to hear, but when they get into the organization, it's different. It's a completely different personality. Sometimes you wonder, wait, was it the same person I interviewed?
Well, again, interviewing is always difficult, and it's a skill.
Mm-hmm.
But I think persons that would have been interviewed by me know that many times you come across persons who are very nervous,
Mm-hmm.
and that sometimes doesn't give you a good view of the person.
Mm-hmm.
So usually what I try to do when I interview a person is I try to let them relax, and then I try to get the topic onto topics that I think they're very comfortable on, so that I can see a natural reaction. So if I notice you're left-handed, I might comment on the fact that you're left-handed. I try to find something, or I try to find some person, or try to find some interest that both of us could have, that I can see how you interact in a very common situation. So I'm usually, if I'm interviewing a person, there's a certain part of the interview where I'm not looking for how much they know of my organization, because certainly if it's entry level, then the person probably doesn't know anything. But do they have good skills? Do they have good manners? Are they quick thinkers? Do they how do they respond if they have asked them a question that they don't know? Those are some of the things that are going to happen in real life, in customer situations. I don't think you can expect that every customer that comes up to you is going to be able to ask you a question and that person knows everything. But it's how you react when you don't know. How do you respond? And can you be honest? I mean, if somebody says, "Look, I honestly don't know the answer to that question," that probably scores better for me than a person who tries to hoodwink me into thinking that they're knowledgeable about a subject they're not.
True. Well, on that note, we're going to take a break. We'll be right back after these messages.
On the Apex of Training and Development Show's Tip of the Week 7, we have the one and only Chef Beard.
Good day. My name is Chef Beard, and my tip of the week is the darkest part of the night is just before dawn. So when you're thinking about quitting, don't quit, because your breakthrough is right around the corner. Can't stop, won't stop. Food is life. Chef Beard.
Don't forget to like, comment, and share for more content, and follow the Apex of Training and Development Show's Facebook page. Stay locked in to find out who will be in next week's Tip of the Week. This episode of the Apex of Training and Development Show was brought to you by the following sponsors.
Thank you for staying glued to the Apex of Training and Development. We're here with Mr. Clement Samuel, Director of Sales for Digicel Antigua, Barbuda, and Montserrat. And we're discussing creating and maintaining an organizational culture of excellence. Mr. Samuel, who do you think is responsible for setting the tone of an organization?
I think most definitely the senior management team. I think ultimately the CEO and her management team, in the case of Digicel, they are responsible for setting the tone that the other employees should follow. I think that you have to do that by incorporating training. That's key to anything if you're going to instill change. You have to also recognize that people will make mistakes, and you have to create a culture of forgiveness for persons will make mistakes, but you always try to encourage them to do better. Many times people come into the workplace and people think that after they've been there for a year they know it all, and so people sometimes do not react positively to training. But you've got to find a way where training is just part of the culture of the organization. What is relevant today may not be relevant in 2 weeks because different things change. And so I think, if I were to summarize, it's definitely the senior management team, and it has to be continual training, continual evaluation, and just trying and ensuring that you keep improving.
But why do you think persons are so resistant to change within an organization?
I think some of it is cultural. I think some of it is people like doing the same thing. And usually when you are instilling change, people are just a little bit uncomfortable. Oh, we've done it before. It has always worked. And so they're probably not seeing the bigger picture, that there is an inherent problem that we're trying to solve, and that we can't keep doing the same thing and expecting a different result. So I think you have to just incorporate that in the mentality and in the, I don't want to use culture again, but in the ethos of the organization, and I think you eventually get it right.
But then what else can be done to get the employees to embrace change? And then sometimes you have managers that are also resistant to change.
Yes, I think it's people are people. I hear and I remember a few years ago, maybe before, when you were a little smaller, it was always a question of, we needed to introduce traffic lights in Antigua. It'd be more organized. We introduced traffic lights. Then I hear discussions on the radio that the traffic lights slow down the traffic. So it's whatever you do, you are going to get people resistance in some way. I think what you need, however, is leadership, deciding that you're going in a particular direction, and you've got to take your organization with you.
But do you think influence as a leader plays a critical role in order to get buy-in from the employees? Well, if you don't have influence, how do you get buy-in?
Well, put it this way, if you don't have influence, you probably shouldn't be a leader. I think that basically, if you are on the senior management team, one of the reasons why you should be there is because you are influential, you are thought, or is certainly the persons who appointed you there think that you can be an influential person, and that as much of your role as supervising, managing, it is influencing those below you, sometimes to do things that they may not initially want to do, but you've got to convince them that this is where the organization is headed and this is where we must go. If you're a leader, you've got to lead.
Apart from influence, from a leader's perspective, what are some of the requisite skills needed by employees and probably leaders in order to create and maintain an organizational culture of excellence?
I think flexibility is one. I think you have also got to be, certainly from a leader, you've got to be a good listener. You have got to evaluate, because sometimes you can, well, go along a particular path because you're a leader and you're thinking this is the way we need to go. But you have got to also ensure that there is a mechanism for you to get feedback from your staff. And many, I won't say many times, but sometimes it could be that there's positive feedback that they can give you, which means that you have got to change the whole construct of what you're doing just slightly to get the effect. And so I think the best leaders are those who can take the feedback and can adapt to, best suits the situation. Sometimes as leaders, we've got to realize that we don't know everything, and that if we knew everything and we could do everything ourselves, we wouldn't need staff. The bare fact that you are in a cohesive relationship, it means that both parties must listen to each other. Yes, you're the leader, you are offering direction, but there are many times then suggestions come in that you could do certain things better or differently, and you've got to take it on board.
And most of the times it is the line staff. They're the ones that are interacting with the customers.
That is true.
So they should be a part of the decision-making process. Absolutely. We're going to take a break, and when we return, we'll continue on our discussion on creating an organizational culture of excellence with Mr. Clement Samuel, Director of Sales at Digicel, Antigua, Barbuda, and Montserrat. We'll be right back.
This episode of the Apex of Training and Development Show was brought to you by the following sponsors.
Thank you for staying locked into the Apex of Training and Development Show. We're here with Mr. Clement Samuel, Director of Sales for Antigua, Barbuda, and Montserrat. Mr. Samuel, I think my biggest question is, how do you maintain an organizational culture of excellence? It is one thing to create one, but how do you maintain it?
I think to maintain it, you have got to have a mechanism in place for continuous evaluation. Because keeping something excellent, keeping something at a particular level is something that needs to be done on an ongoing basis. So first of all, you've got to have measures for, checking your scores, checking to see how your customers think of you, doing surveys, mystery shoppers. You've always got to do things to make sure that you are there, and you've always got to have continuous training with your staff, because once the staff feel that they know it all, then just a natural thing that performances are going to fall off. The other thing that I think that is very key in something like this is you've also got to have mentors for the staff as well. That's people that they can look up to. You've got to try and motivate them even outside of their normal sphere. You may find someone who is doing well, but who in 4 or 5 years time you could see having a totally different position. Now, one of the ways you can keep that employee really keyed in is if you can mentor them and let them see the bigger picture, that you are only doing a sales role now, but you've got the potential someday to be a supervisor, and you give that person that sort of encouragement and that sort of mentorship, you'll be surprised sometimes how the performance and how the attitude totally changes.
That is so true, because motivation really, well, that sort of incentive really acts as a motivator to get persons to perform at their optimal. Quite
That's correct.
interesting. Mr. Samuel, we're in a pandemic, and I believe many organizations are using this opportunity to shift their organization culture to what they would like it to be. What advice would you give to those leaders?
This is something that's happening, and so the advice I may give is just what I think at the moment. First of all, I think that with the pandemic, the biggest problem that many employers or managers have is you're having a lot less contact with your employees. And one of the key things is, how do you then judge performance? If you are not seeing, if most of your employees are working from home, the time that you are interacting with them is limited compared to previous times. Then are the measures that you're using to assess that employee relevant? And I think that first of all, what employers need to do is they need to have a relook and re-strategize. Am I measuring the right things about this employee? Before the pandemic, punctuality may have been very important. Now, is that a relevant stuff when a person is working from home? But you may also want to know how frequent are your reports, how timely are the reports, and so you may just have to shift how you measure performance. And I think that is absolutely key in senior management, measuring staff, and performance reviews during a pandemic.
But you mentioned submitting reports on time. What are some of the other ways managers could measure productivity? Because is that the only way?
Well, again,
with employees being at home?
Again, every situation is different. And I suppose, if you think hypothetically, if you're an insurance agent, it may be all right, you are working from home, you're not coming into the office, but a measure could be how many premiums are you collecting? How many new people are you signing up for insurance? That could be a measure. But then, you could also look at it, I'm looking at a hypothetical situation with insurance where half of your client base may no longer be employed. And if half of your client base is no longer employed, would it be fair to judge the agent because he's not getting in as much premiums as before? You may want to find out, a better measure may be how many of his customers is he speaking to on a weekly basis. Does he have a report that he can say what is their financial situation? Can he report when are they likely, or what's the likelihood for them being able to resume their premiums? And that may be a better measure than just simply how much money you've brought in. And that's just a simple example of,
or even the report,
because you could be doing reports on time, you could be doing reports on time, no money coming in, you could be bringing in half the money, but you haven't reported that half of your clients have no prospects of paying their premiums in the next 6 months if the pandemic continues. And you were saying, do these policies lapse? Those are the sorts of things that you'd have to take into consideration. So I think that basically what managers have to understand, that in a pandemic things have changed. You have got to probably be more proactive. You're seeing less of your staff, but as a manager it's probably going to be more difficult for you, and it's going to be more challenging for you to provide the kind of support that your staff need. So it's probably going to take more of your time.
Quite informative. We're going to take a break, and when we return, we'll be focusing on the consequences of not creating the right organizational culture. We'll be right back after these messages.
This episode of the Apex of Training and Development Show was brought to you by the following sponsors.
And we're back on the Apex of Training and Development Show with Mr. Clement Samuel, Director of Sales for Digicel Antigua, Barbuda, and Montserrat. Mr. Samuel, I must say, while we were on that break, I had the privilege of having a sip of Paradiso water, and it was quite refreshing. All right, so before the break, we mentioned that we'll be looking at the consequences of not setting the right culture. What are some of the consequences?
Well, I think ultimately all businesses are in existence to make a profit and to do well. If you do not have the right culture, ultimately I think the business will fail. And if the business fails, your profits are considerably lower. So I think that, first of all, there are financial incentives for having a culture of excellence and even surviving in these trying times. With the pandemic, a whole modus operandi of many businesses has changed. Things that we could not get done before. I mean, you've had the banks trying to get us to go to online. And people have resisted. And then there's a pandemic, and suddenly everything is online. So I think persons, if you do not have a culture of organizational excellence, and you're not willing to change and change quickly, you could possibly go the way of the dinosaurs and be extinct.
What about the employees? From the employees' perspective, there are no standards in place. Persons are just functioning ad hocly. How do you think it will have an impact on the mental health of employees? And I'm specifically looking at it from a perspective where there's conflict in the work environment, where employees are dissatisfied with the way management treat them.
Are you talking relative to the pandemic, or are you talking in general?
Generally.
Again, one of the things you have to do with your staff, and remember we talked about continuous training. One of the things I think that's important for you to have training with your staff on is resolving conflicts. Conflicts have been there from the start of the time, but you have got to find ways of persons in an organization having a conflict and resolving it amicably. Now, sometimes this is because people have got different backgrounds, people have got different perspectives, but I think so long as it's done respectfully, and sometimes as a manager you've got to make a firm decision. It doesn't work sometimes being a manager if you never come up with a decision and all you're doing is you're placating. But you've got to make a firm decision sometimes, but many times what you've got to do is get the parties who have the conflict, look, and hopefully everybody sees the other person's point of view, and you can move on from that.
But what if you're unaware that the conflict exists, but then you notice it's hurting your customer service? Because I've had instances where I've gone into organizations, you could see there is internal conflict, and it has an adverse impact on the service that is delivered.
Fine. The bit I didn't understand is that you're not aware that there's a conflict. I think that's what you said.
Yes.
So again, what I think you're saying is you go into an organization, you recognize that there's a problem, and what you've got to do is you have got to investigate to find what is the source of the problem.
Exactly.
And that what you're finding, that what you thought may have been the source of the problem may not have been the source, but it is something else.
So which means supervisors need to be more vigilant.
More vigilant and more observant.
Absolutely, absolutely. How have you set the framework to demonstrate excellence to your staff so that they could follow?
Well, for me personally, I'm in sales, and usually what I tell my team, and it's the motto that I live by, I said I take every call. I get calls 10, 11 o'clock at night.
And you accept it.
I accept the calls. Or if I don't accept the calls, I certainly make sure that the first thing the next morning that I return the call. Because a person doesn't call me, that's the motto I have. A person doesn't call me just because they want to call me. A person calls me because there's an issue. And I, as a manager, or as somebody who is responsible and representing Digicel, doesn't have the luxury of being able to say to that customer, I can't deal with it now. Your problem becomes my problem. I've got to deal with it, and if I cannot deal with it right now, as soon as I get it, I will call you back. And so I usually tell my staff, I always have voicemail. I never like to see my light on. If somebody leaves a message for me, that means they didn't get me. I call them back, and I make sure that I solve whatever their issue is, or I give my best attempt to solve what the issue is. And that's the creed that I live by, and that's what I try to instill in my staff.
What advice would you give to a leader who would like to change their organization's culture but just don't know how to?
Well, I think there are many persons out there who can come in and do an assessment for them. But I think that if you're a leader and you recognize that your organization needs changing, I think that's the first good step, because at least you recognize that something needs to be done. I think what I would do in a particular situation like that, I would sort of reach out to outside consultants and ask them to come in and do an assessment. After having done an assessment, you are probably in a better position to determine what are some of the options that you may have. It could be simply be training. It could be a situation where it means that you have got to right size. Maybe you've got the wrong persons in certain positions, and you have got to I wouldn't want to say maneuver, but you've got to right size that sort of situation. And sometimes this can be problematic because you've got unions involved, you've got things. But again, as I said, we all go back to the pandemic. None of us planned for the pandemic, but the pandemic came and you've got to adapt. So if you find yourself in a situation like that, where you've got to adapt, then as a leader, you don't have the luxury of saying, I'll deal with that another day. You've got to deal with it now if you want your organization to continue and to progress.
Mr. Samuel, it was a pleasure having you on the Apex of Training and Development show. I know that the information you provided today will be very useful to users, and hopefully we can have you on a part 2 to give us a follow-up on what Digicel is doing. I see that you guys have relaunched your brand.
That's for another conversation, but we have relaunched, so watch this space for Digicel.
All right.
And pop into our stores and see what we've got for you.
All right. I hope it's something good.
Always.
All right. On behalf of the production team here at the Apex of Training and Development show, we'd like to thank you, our viewing audience, for tuning in to another episode, and we look forward to having you on our next show. I'm your host, Charian Casimir. Good evening.
If you like tonight's episode and think that your business can benefit from our training and development program, just send us an email at apextraining268@gmail.com or give us a call at 268-726-7184. That's 268-726-7184. Sharian's Hair and Makeup Supplies were sponsored by Beauty Rama Cosmetics, located on Old Palm Road and Redcliffe Street, St. John's, Antigua. On next week's episode of the Apex of Training and Development Show, we'll be discussing strategic management in the aviation industry with Cameron Singh, Area General Manager at Signature Flight Support.